Okay, so now let's talk about another very important block in Terraform, and that is called the data block. So data block allows data to be fetched or computed for use elsewhere in Terraform configuration. Use of data sources allows a Terraform configuration to make use of information defined outside of Terraform or defined by some other separate Terraform configuration. So now let's create a new Terraform configuration. Now in this particular Terraform configuration, what I will do is I'll create a virtual machine. So I already have a network, and this network has two subnets, that is subnet 1 and subnet 2. So within subnet 1, I will create my virtual machine. But to create a virtual machine, I also need a public IP address. And this public IP address, I need to connect to my NIC. And this NIC will be connected to my virtual machine. So in total, I need to create three resources: a public IP address, a NIC, and a virtual machine. So let's look at the configuration. So this is a brand new configuration and it's distinct from the previous one. So here what I need to do is I need to use the data block and get information about this particular resource group that I had created previously. Now using this particular data block, I can get a lot of information about this particular resource group. So let's look at the documentation and let's see what all information we can get. So I go to my documentation and let's just paste this particular resource group. Again, you can do this using Google as well. Now, if you look at your resources, there are two. There is one resource and then there is one called data source. So data source is what we need to look into. So let's click on this particular resource group. So this gives you a documentation about the data block for your Azure resource group. So let's go down and let's see the attribute reference. So these are the attribute reference that you can get from this particular data block. You can get the ID, the location, and the tags. And the input that you need to give is the name. So again, let's go back to our code. So I've given the input as name, and I can get the location, the ID, and the tags. Now here I need to get the location because I'll be using this location in a resource group later on. So here, for example, for the NIC, I need to get the location. So using this particular data block, I can get the location for this particular resource group. Similarly, I've also created a data block for the virtual network as well as for the subnet in which I need to get my virtual machine created. And again, for the virtual network, the input that I need to give is the name as well as the resource group. So this resource group I can just get using the concatenation of the resource group type, the name of that type, and the name. Similarly, for the data block for the subnet, I need to use three inputs: the name, the virtual network, as well as the resource group. So once we've created these three data blocks, then we can start creating our resource blocks. So let's start by creating the public IP address. Again, for the public IP address, you first need to give the name of the IP address, public IP address. Then there is an allocation type. This can be static or dynamic. Now again, you can look at the documentation for this particular resource block and get all the valid information. So let's do that. Again, I go back to my documentation. So now let's look at the arguments. So again, the allocation method is a required field and it defines the allocation method for this IP address. The possible values are static or dynamic. So a dynamic public IPs are not allocated until they are assigned to a resource. So that's the difference between a dynamic and a static. Okay, so we've created the public IP. Now let's create the resource group. Now let's create the network interface. Again, the network interface requires the resource group location that we get from the data block as well as the name of the data block. And then you need to give the IP configuration as well. Now here you need to provide the subnet in which you want the NIC to be in, as well as the name of your IP configuration and whether you want it dynamic. And here you need to link your particular public IP address that you created previously. And again, this is the ID and not the name. So you should always remember that this particular ID is only created after the apply is done. That is after the resource has been created. And after that, you can just create your virtual machine. So again, you can go search for this particular resource block. So you can again Google it. So if you want to find the resource block, you can always type create an virtual machine instance in Terraform. So I'll also specify Azure. So this is the resource block that I need to use. So here you can see that there are a lot of arguments that you need to give. So you can just go through this documentation. It'll take up a lot of time to go through them one by one. So if you look at the example, you can see that. So if you look at this piece of code, you can see that I have created a Linux box that is of standard B1S. This is basically the cheapest one, so it's preferable to use this. And then you've linked your NIC card. So this was the same NIC that you had created previously. Now again, this is the ID and not the name. So again, it's the type, the name of that particular type, and the ID. So this is applied once the NIC is created. And everything else is the same. The only difference here is that I'm using a password and not using a public private key. And this is the name of my user and this is the password. So let us deploy this particular piece of code. So to do that, again, I'll do a Terraform apply. And here it states that it's going to add 3 new resources. So let's just click on yes. So once again, let me reiterate all the 3 resources that we'll create. The first one would be the public IP address. The second is the NIC, and the NIC will be linked to the public IP address, and this particular NIC will be linked to the virtual machine. So overall, there are 3 resources that we'll create. So let me click on yes. Okay, so you can see that these 3 resources have been created. So now let's go back to our Azure console. Let's click on virtual machines. So here you can see that my virtual machine has been created. So it's still in the creating process. So let's just refresh this. So it's running now. So let's try to access this particular virtual machine. So I'll open this. I need to refresh it. And you can click on connect, click on SSH. So I'll not be using the private key, I'll be just using the password. So I can just skip this particular /i. So let me copy this and I'll just go to my command prompt. I'll paste this and I'll just remove the /i. Click on yes. And then you need to give the password. So the password is this is the password. It's password 12345. So let me just and you are able to log in. So this is how you can create a virtual machine using Terraform. So I hope this was a useful lecture. I'll see you soon.